There are places in this world, and beyond it, in the architecture of myth, that do not simply exist to be found. They exist to be felt, to be feared, to press upon the chest of the imagination like a great stone rolled across the mouth of something ancient and unknowable. The labyrinth is one of those places, long before the word made its way into the language of psychology. Long before we spoke of labyrinths as metaphors for thought, for bureaucracy, for the winding corridors of grief. There was an actual structure, or rather, there was the idea of one. And in the world of ancient Greece, where the boundary between idea and reality was far more permeable than we might suppose today, an idea held with enough conviction became something very close to truth. The labyrinth, as the Greeks understood it, was not merely a maze. A maze, after all, is a puzzle. You enter it with pencil in hand, with patience, with a quiet confidence that there is a way out, and that you will, in time, find it. The labyrinth offered no such reassurance. It was built not to challenge its visitors, but to consume them, to receive them, and to keep them. It was a place designed with a singular, terrible purpose, to hold something inside that the world outside could not be allowed to see. That something was the Minotaur. Imagine for a moment what it would mean to know such a creature existed. Not in some distant wilderness, not in the shadowed corners of the sea, but here, beneath the island of Crete, beneath the palace of a king, breathing in the dark, half man, half bull, moving through passageways it could not fully comprehend, living in a darkness so complete that the concept of a horizon had no meaning. The Greeks gave it the name Asterion, the star, which may strike us now as tender, even poetic, and perhaps it was meant to be. Perhaps even the ancients felt a tremor of something like pity for the thing that Minos had hidden beneath his flaws. But the labyrinth was not built out of pity. It was built out of necessity. Its architect was Daedalus, a name that deserves a breath of reverence on its own. For Daedalus was no ordinary craftsman. He was, in the tradition of the Greeks, a man touched by something divine in his ingenuity, a mortal whose mind bent toward invention the way a river bends toward the sea. He had come to Crete under the hospitality of King Minos, and it was Minos who gave him this commission: build me something that cannot be escaped. Build me something that cannot be understood from the inside. Build me a structure so perfectly, so deliberately wrong in its geometry, that even its designer, standing within its walls, would lose his way. And Daedalus did. What emerged from that commission was a structure of such devilish complexity that no account has ever fully described it, because no account could. The ancient sources gesture toward it with reverence and unease. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Hallways that turned upon themselves, chambers that appeared to offer passage, and then sealed themselves into dead ends, corridors that curved so subtly, over such long distances that a man walking them in a straight line would find himself, hours later, facing the direction from which he came. It was, in short, a mind made of stone, and not a benevolent mind. It lay beneath the palace at Knossos, on the island of Crete. And Knossos itself was one of the great wonders of the ancient Aegean world, a palace of extraordinary sophistication, with running water and frescoed walls, and a complexity of architecture that still astonishes the modern eye when we walk its excavated remains. And yet beneath all of that grandeur, beneath all of those painted dolphins and spiraling columns, something breathed. Into the labyrinth, the people of Athens were made to send tribute. 14 young men and women, every 9 years, delivered to the shores of Crete like an offering, not to a god, to an appetite. They were sent into the darkness, and the doors were closed behind them, and what happened then was left to the imagination, which, in its way, may be the crueler fate. for the imagination never spares us. Until Theseus. The story of Theseus and the Labyrinth is, at its heart, a story about a thread, a young prince who volunteered himself among the sacrificial 14, a princess named Ariadne, who loved him at first sight and pressed into his hand a simple ball of thread. "Tie it at the entrance," she told him. "Hold it as you walk. And when the darkness becomes total and the walls have stolen your sense of direction, follow it back." It is such a quiet solution to such a monstrous problem, and yet that is precisely what makes it eternal. In a place designed to confound every human faculty, the answer was not cleverness. It was not strength, though Theseus had plenty of that. It was continuity. Connection. The unbroken line between where you are and where you began. We will, in the segments ahead, follow that thread ourselves, back through the architecture of this legend, through the life of Daedalus and the tragedy that awaited him, through the nature of the Minotaur and the world that created him, through the archaeology of Crete and the question of how much of this myth may have grown from the soil of something real. But for now, simply sit with the image, a darkness beneath a palace, a creature at its center, a thread unspooling through stone corridors, and somewhere, in the black distance, the sound of something enormous, waiting. The labyrinth has always been there. We are only just beginning to walk it. There is a particular kind of genius that the ancient world regarded with something less than pure admiration. A genius so complete, so restless, so utterly ungoverned by the limits that nature seems to have set as gentle reminders of our humanity, that the gods themselves were said to watch it with narrowed eyes. Daedalus was that kind of genius, and his story, wound so tightly through the legend of the labyrinth, is in many ways a more haunting tale than the one involving the creature at its center. He did not begin on Crete. He began in Athens. Athens, in the mythological tradition, was already a city of extraordinary minds, a place where craft and thought were held in the same high esteem, where the goddess Athena extended her particular protection over those who made things well. And Daedalus made things better than anyone. He was descended, the myths tell us, from the royal line of Erechtheus, one of Athens's earliest kings, which gave him not only a noble lineage but a particular intimacy with the city's traditions of excellence. He fashioned statues that were said to move, to blink, to walk, to breathe, with such uncanny lifelikeness that people would bind them at night so they would not wander from their pedestals. He built tools and mechanisms that had never existed before. He was, by every ancient account, a man who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be made, which is precisely why the story of his nephew is so devastating. The boy's name, depending on which account you follow, was either Perdix or Talos. He was young, perhaps 12 or 13 years of age, and he had been sent to apprentice under his uncle, to learn at the feet of the greatest craftsman alive. And he was learning, perhaps too well, for it is said that the boy one afternoon picked up the spine of a fish from the ground and ran his fingers along its serrated edge, and from that simple observation, the way a skeleton could be a saw, the way nature had already solved the problem of a cutting edge, he fashioned the first saw. He invented it as a child discovers a song, naturally, without effort, in a single afternoon. Daedalus, looking on, felt something shift inside him, something cold and very quiet. He recognized in this child not a student, but a successor, not a continuation of his legacy, but a replacement of it. And rather than let that recognition move him toward generosity, rather than understanding that genius is not diminished by being shared, he led the boy to the edge of a high cliff overlooking the Athenian Acropolis, and he pushed him. The goddess Athena, taking pity on the child, transformed him mid-fall into a partridge, a bird that, ever since, is said to nest close to the ground and never build in high places, having learned, even in its feathered body, the memory of what it means to fall. Daedalus was exiled from Athens for what he had done, and so he came, by ship and circumstance, to Crete. King Minos received him with the open arms of a man who knew talent when he saw it. Crete, under Minos, was the dominant naval power of the Aegean world, wealthy, sophisticated, culturally refined in ways that the mainland Greeks of that era could not easily match. The palace at Knossos, which modern archaeology has revealed to be a structure of breathtaking complexity, was already a monument to Minoan civilization's extraordinary achievements. And yet Minos wanted more. He wanted wonders. And Daedalus, who was very good at producing wonders, settled into his new home with the cautious relief of a man who knows he has escaped one catastrophe and is not yet aware that he is walking toward another. For a time, things went well. Daedalus built and invented and was celebrated. He became, in the language of the court, indispensable. And indispensability, in the world of powerful kings, is a condition that curdles quickly into captivity. The commission for the Labyrinth arose from a sequence of events almost operatic in its tragedy. A divine curse, a queen's unnatural desire, a bull sent by Poseidon as a demonstration of oceanic power, and a king who, having promised to sacrifice that bull to the god, and then kept it for his own herds instead, found that the gods have a long memory and a very particular sense of humor. The details of how the Minotaur came to exist are, in their way, a separate story entirely, one we will come to in the segment that follows. But the point, for now, is that Daedalus was the one who made it possible, not the Minotaur itself. That was the work of divine punishment, but the concealment of it, the housing of it, the engineering of a space that could contain something the world had never seen before and, Minos fervently hoped, would never need to see again. So Daedalus built the Labyrinth. What he built, in architectural terms, was something that seems to have lodged itself into the collective imagination of an entire civilization. The Greek word for labyrinth, labyrinthos, may predate the Greek language itself, possibly deriving from the pre-Greek labres, meaning the double-headed axe that was the central sacred symbol of Minoan Crete, images of which archaeologists have found carved into the very walls of Knossos with remarkable frequency. Whether the labyrinth was named for the axe, or whether the association ran in the other direction, is a question that scholarship has turned over for generations without arriving at a firm answer. But the connection is suggestive. The double-headed axe cuts in both directions. It faces two ways at once. It is, at its very nature, a thing of duality. And duality is exactly what the labyrinth contained, a structure of extraordinary human craft wrapped around something that was neither fully human nor fully animal. When Daedalus completed his work, Minos was satisfied. The Minotaur was below. The doors were sealed. The problem, if a living creature that breathes and moves and requires feeding can be called a problem, was managed, if not solved. But Daedalus had made an error that brilliant people make with alarming regularity. He had made himself too useful. He knew where the Minotaur was. He knew the labyrinth's logic. He knew, because he had designed it, the single thread of reasoning that could lead a person through it. And when Theseus eventually arrived from Athens with his dark-sailed ship and his quietly declared intention to end the tribute, it was to Daedalus that Ariadne went. It was Daedalus who told her about the thread. It was Daedalus who handed over, in that quiet moment, the key to his own greatest creation. When Minos discovered this, when Theseus escaped and the Minotaur was dead, and the evidence pointed, as evidence so often does, toward the one man brilliant enough to have helped, his response was not execution. That would have been almost merciful. Instead, Minos imprisoned Daedalus and his son Icarus in the labyrinth itself. The architect locked inside his own architecture, the inventor trapped by his own invention. What Daedalus felt in those corridors he had himself designed, whose every turn he had calculated, whose every dead end he had placed with deliberate precision. We can only imagine. Presumably no thread had been left for him. Presumably he found his way by memory alone, tracing and retracing a structure that existed as much in his mind as in the stone around him. And presumably, in those long hours of walking his own creation, he arrived at the conclusion that the labyrinth had no flaw that could be exploited from within, that the only way out was not through its corridors at all. The only way out was up. And so Daedalus, with the patience of a man who has spent a lifetime solving problems that other men could not even articulate, gathered feathers. He collected wax. He studied the architecture of birds with the same careful attention he had once given to fish spines and running water and the geometry of enclosure. And from these materials, the simplest imaginable, the kind a child might carry home from a walk, he built 2 pairs of wings. The escape of Daedalus and Icarus from the labyrinth is among the most famous departures in all of literature, and its aftermath. The boy climbing too high, the wax softening in the warmth of the Aegean sun, the feathers loosening and drifting, and the long, terrible silence of a fall, is among the most famous tragedies. There is something unbearably circular about it. Daedalus, who once pushed a child from a height and was exiled for it, now watched a child fall from a height and could do nothing. The partridge that Athena made from Perdix is said to have watched Icarus fall into the sea, watched and understood. Daedalus made it to Sicily. He lived out his days there, never returning to Crete, never returning to Athens, building things still, presumably, creating still, but never, according to any tradition that survives, building anything again that required a labyrinth to contain what it had made. Some lessons arrive too late, but they do eventually arrive. There is a tendency, when we tell old stories, to move quickly past the monster. We linger on the hero, we study the architect, we trace the thread back through the fingers of the princess who held it, and we follow Theseus into the dark with something like anticipation, because we already know how it ends. We have always known how it ends, and that foreknowledge wraps the story in a comfortable safety. The monster dies. The hero returns. The thread holds. But slow down for a moment. Step back from the entrance of the labyrinth, before the torch is lit and the door is sealed. Consider the thing inside. Consider Asterion. Because the Minotaur, if we are honest with ourselves, is not merely a monster, it is a consequence. And consequences, however terrible their shape, deserve to be understood before they are simply destroyed. The story of how the Minotaur came to exist begins, as so many Greek tragedies do, with a man who made a promise to a god and then quietly decided not to keep it. King Minos of Crete was, by most ancient accounts, a ruler of genuine ability. Shrewd, powerful, politically sophisticated, in the way that island rulers must be when the sea surrounds them on all sides and rivals wait on every horizon. He had claimed his throne by divine right, asking Poseidon, god of the sea, to send a sign of legitimacy. Poseidon obliged, as gods occasionally do, sending forth from the waves a bull of such extraordinary beauty, white as sea foam, perfectly formed, almost luminous in its physical perfection, that the island of Crete seemed to hold its breath at the sight of it. The agreement was simple. The bull would be sent as a sign. In return, Minos would sacrifice it back to Poseidon. A gift acknowledged and returned. The kind of clean, reciprocal arrangement that keeps the relationship between mortals and gods from becoming complicated. Minos looked at the bull, he thought about his herds, and he decided, with the particular rationalizing logic of powerful men who are accustomed to having their decisions affirmed rather than questioned, that surely Poseidon would not mind if he kept this one. It was so fine an animal. Any bull from his existing herds would serve just as well for the sacrifice. Poseidon, vast and ancient, and occupied with the management of all the world's oceans, would surely not notice. Poseidon noticed. The punishment he devised was not violent. It was not immediate. It was, in the manner of divine retribution, at its most sophisticated, architectural. He caused Minos's wife, the queen Pasiphae, to fall into an unnatural and devastating obsession with the white bull. An obsession so total, so consuming, that it became the defining catastrophe of the Minoan royal house. Pasiphae herself was not an ordinary woman. She was the daughter of Helios, the sun god, and sister to Circe, the great sorceress of the Odyssey. She carried divine blood in her veins, and yet the curse fell upon her as completely as it would have fallen upon anyone. Because that, of course, was precisely the point. Even the divinely born are not beyond the reach of Poseidon's displeasure. It was to conceal and enable this obsession that Daedalus was first called upon by the royal household, and the device he constructed for Pasiphae is described in the ancient sources with a specificity that the reader is, perhaps, grateful is not more specific. The point is that Daedalus complied, and the point beyond that point is that from this compliance, from this intersection of divine curse and human craft and a king's broken promise, a child was born. The child was named Asterion. In his early years, we are told almost nothing. The ancient sources are, perhaps mercifully, quiet on the subject of the Minotaur's infancy and childhood. We do not know at what age the bull's nature became fully apparent, whether it emerged gradually, like a tide, or arrived all at once like a storm. We do not know whether Pasiphae held him. We do not know whether Minos looked at the child and felt anything other than horror and the cold political calculus of a man already thinking about concealment. We do not know whether Asterion ever understood what he was or what had been done to make him. What we do know is that eventually Minos could no longer manage the creature's existence above ground, and so the commission went to Daedalus, and the labyrinth was built, and Asterion went into the dark. Here is what the Greek tradition gives us of the Minotaur's appearance: the body of a man and the head of a bull. In some accounts, the legs and lower body are also bovine. In others, only the head marks the division, which, if you consider it carefully, is the more unsettling image. A man's hands, a man's chest, a man's posture and gait and proportion, and then that enormous alien head with its curved horns and its dark eyes set wide apart and its breath, warm and heavy, moving through the stone corridors in the silence below the palace. The ancient Greeks were not, as a civilization, inclined toward extended sympathy for their monsters. Their mythology is populated with creatures that exist largely to be overcome: gorgons and hydras and cyclopes and scyllas, each one a test through which a hero must pass in order to become more fully himself. The monster's function in this architecture of meaning is instrumental. It serves the story of someone else. And yet something about the Minotaur has always resisted this purely instrumental reading. Something about Asterion, about that name, above all, has caused artists and poets and philosophers, across more than 2,000 years of engagement with this myth, to return to the creature with something more than simple revulsion. The Roman poet Ovid, writing in his Metamorphoses, describes the Minotaur as evidence of Pasiphae's shameful love, a framing that places blame on the mother while the god who engineered the whole situation goes largely unexamined, which is the kind of moral economy that ancient literature occasionally offers us, and that we are not obligated to accept. But even within Ovid's telling, there is a quality to the Minotaur's presence that lingers. It is monstrous, yes. It consumes the Athenian tributes, yes. But it did not choose its nature. It did not select its form or its hunger, or the darkness in which it was made to live. The tributes themselves are worth pausing over. Every 9 years, or annually, in some versions of the myth, Athens sent 14 young people to Crete. 7 young men, 7 young women. They were sent into the labyrinth, The door was closed, and the darkness received them. The ancient sources are not entirely consistent about what happened next. Some suggest the Minotaur hunted and consumed them in the straightforward manner of a predator. Others suggest something more wandering and perhaps more terrible, that the tribute simply became lost, stumbling through the corridors until exhaustion and darkness and thirst accomplished what the creature itself might not have needed to. The number 9 is significant in Greek mythology. It recurs with the frequency of a recurring dream, attached to cycles of time and divine punishment, and the slow working out of cosmic consequences. Every 9 years, Athens paid. Every 9 years, the weight of Minos's broken promise was redistributed onto people who had had nothing to do with the making of it. This is, of course, deeply unjust. It is meant to be. The myth is not endorsing the tribute system. It is describing the world as it is, in which the powerful extract suffering from the less powerful and frame that extraction as necessity, as tribute, as simply the way things are, until someone decides that the way things are is not the way things must remain. There is one final thing worth considering before we move toward Theseus and the thread and the end that was always coming. In the centuries after the classical period, a tradition emerged, quiet, never dominant, but persistent, of imagining the Minotaur not as a ravening predator, but as something closer to a prisoner. An artist's rendering on a particular Greek vase, now housed in a museum in Rome, shows the Minotaur seated, head bowed, in a posture that reads less as menace than as exhaustion, a creature that has been waiting in the dark for a very long time, for something it cannot name and cannot expect. Whether that reading is faithful to the original myth is in some ways beside the point. What matters is that it kept being made, that generation after generation of people who knew this story found themselves returning to that figure in the dark, not with swords raised, but with something quieter, something that looked almost like recognition. We have all, at some point, lived in a labyrinth that we did not build. We have all found ourselves in the dark, in a space whose architecture makes no sense to us, waiting for something. We are not sure what to find its way in. The Minotaur waited for Theseus. What Theseus brought with him when he finally came was not mercy. But perhaps something in Astion by that point was no longer asking for it. Every generation produces, in its mythology if not always in its history, a figure who walks toward the thing that everyone else is walking away from, not out of recklessness, not out of an inability to measure the danger, but out of a quality that the Greeks understood very precisely and valued above almost everything else, a quality they called arete, excellence, the full expression of what a human being, at their very best, is capable of being. Theseus was that figure for Athens, and his story, like all the best stories, begins not with a sword drawn or a monster faced, but with a father, a pair of sandals, and a heavy stone. His origins were, in the mythological tradition, appropriately complex. His mother was Aethra, daughter of the king of Troezen, a small city on the northeastern Peloponnese, where the air comes off the water, cool and sharp, and the hills rise quickly behind the harbor. His father, or one of his fathers, for the Greeks were comfortable with a certain productive ambiguity in these matters, was Aegeus, king of Athens, who had come to Troezen on a visit and stayed long enough to become relevant to the story in a permanent way. His other father, in the tradition that runs parallel to the mortal one, was Poseidon himself, the same god whose offended dignity had set the entire chain of Minoan catastrophe in motion. This divine parentage was not incidental. It meant that Theseus carried within him, from birth, a connection to the sea, to its power and its caprice, that would prove both gift and curse before his story reached its end. Before Aegeus returned to Athens, he did what fathers in myths do when they sense they are leaving something important behind them. He found a great rock on the hillside above Troezen, and beneath it he placed a sword and a pair of sandals. Then he rolled the stone back over them and told Ethra, "When the boy is old enough to lift this stone himself, send him to me. Those will be his proof of identity. Those will be how I know him." Theseus grew, and when the time came, when the muscles across his back were broad enough, and the steadiness in his hands was something more than youth, he lifted the stone, took the sandals and the sword, and set off for Athens, not by the safe sea route, which any sensible traveler of the age would have taken. By land, through the Isthmus of Corinth, along a road populated, in the mythology of that era, with a remarkable concentration of bandits, murderers, and the sort of eccentric, violent men who seem to have regarded the highways of ancient Greece as their personal domain. He dealt with each of them, with Periphetes, who killed travelers with an iron club, and Cines, who bent pine trees to the ground and tied his victims between them, and Siron, who kicked strangers from a cliff into the sea, and Procrustes, whose hospitality was of the kind best declined, the man who had a single bed and made every guest fit it by stretching the short and trimming the tall. Theseus, in each case, applied a justice that the Greeks found deeply satisfying. He killed them with their own methods. He was not, in other words, simply violent. He was symmetrical. He matched the world's cruelty with an answering precision that felt, to an ancient audience, like the proper operation of moral order. By the time he reached Athens, he had already become a story. News traveled slowly in the ancient world, but story traveled fast, and the story that arrived in Athens before Theseus did was of a young man clearing the roads, restoring safety to the passes, doing quietly and on his own initiative the work that kings were supposed to do but rarely managed. Aegeus, old now and caught in the complicated politics of a court full of nephews and claimants who wanted his throne, recognized his son before the sandals were even produced as evidence. Recognized him, it is said, simply by the way he walked into a room. He was welcomed. He was celebrated. He was, for a brief and probably dazzling moment, simply happy. And then the black-sailed ship arrived from Crete. The tribute ships that Minos sent to collect Athens's payment came, by tradition, with black sails, a color chosen with the deliberate psychological cruelty of a powerful state reminding a weaker one, at regular intervals, of its own helplessness. The sails were visible long before the ship entered the harbor. The whole city could watch them approach. The whole city could begin, hours before the ship docked, the process of grief. Theseus watched the black sails come in and made his decision with the directness that characterized everything about him. He would go. He would go as one of the 14. Not as a prince traveling in comfort and with advance notice, but as a tribute in the hold among the others. And if he could find a way to kill the Minotaur, he would. And if he could not, then Athens would lose its prince along with its sons and daughters. And that too would be a kind of answer, a declaration that Athens would no longer simply send its young into the dark and accept the dark's silence in return. Aegeus extracted one promise from his son before the ship departed. The tribute ship sailed with black sails as a mark of mourning. That was Minos's requirement, and Minos's requirement could not be refused. But if Theseus succeeded, if he killed the creature and came home alive, he would change the sails to white. He would give his father that signal from the distance, so that Aegeus would know before the ship even touched the dock that his son was coming home. Theseus promised, and meant it, in the way that young men mean promises before they have learned how much the world between the making and the keeping of a vow can hold. The crossing to Crete was long enough. The reception at Knossos was the reception of a captor receiving what is owed to him, formal, cold, and carrying beneath its surface a quality that Theseus, who was good at reading rooms, recognized immediately as contempt. Minos was a man who had extracted tribute from Athens for long enough that the extraction had become, in his mind, simply the natural order of things. The young people from Athens were not, to him, people in any sense that required him to look at them carefully. They were the interest on a debt. They were arithmetic. But Minos had a daughter. Ariadne had presumably stood at the edge of the tribute reception before, had presumably watched the Athenian young people arrive with their careful dignity and their barely concealed terror, and had felt what? We are not told what she had felt in previous years. We are only told what she felt now, when Theseus stepped off the ship and stood in the Cretan sun and looked around him with the calm attentiveness of a man who is already studying the architecture of a problem he intends to solve. She fell in love with him. The ancient sources state this plainly and without extensive commentary, because to the ancient sources this was not remarkable. The remarkable thing would have been if she hadn't. He was Theseus. He had walked through the isthmus of Corinth killing monsters with their own instruments. He had sailed here voluntarily. He was standing in her father's palace, about to be sent into a labyrinth to be eaten. And he was looking around with the expression of someone who has already begun to work out the angles. It was Ariadne who went to Daedalus. It was Daedalus who told her about the thread, that simple, devastating solution. And it was Ariadne who came to Theseus in the night, in the quiet before the tribute was delivered to the labyrinth, and pressed into his hand what she was pressing into his hand. Not just thread, but the future. Not just a tool, but the radical possibility of a morning after. He made her a promise too, Theseus. He promised that if he came out of the labyrinth alive, he would take her with him. Back to Athens, away from Crete and her father's cold court and the knowledge, which must have lived in her like a stone, of what happened every 9 years in the dark beneath the palace. We will come, in our next segment, to what happened inside. To the thread and the darkness and the encounter at the center of the world's most deliberate architecture. But before we arrive at that door and step through it, stay for a moment with this image, a young woman standing in a Cretan night, listening to the sea, a ball of thread in her hands, the awareness that what she is about to do is irreversible, that once the thread is given, once the door is opened, nothing about her life will ever again be what it was. She gave it anyway. Some acts of courage happen in labyrinths, with swords and torches and the sound of something vast moving in the dark. And some happen in doorways, at night, in the quiet before everything changes. Both kinds are real. Both kinds cost something. The thread unspooled into the dark, and the story moved toward its center. There is a moment, in any journey towards something truly unknown, when the last of the familiar light disappears behind you. Not the moment you stepped away from it. Not the moment you made your decision, or said your goodbyes, or took the first few steps into uncertain territory with the comfortable knowledge that you could still, if you turned, see where you had come from. That moment is difficult, but it is not the one that changes you. The one that makes the journey irreversible in some fundamental way that has nothing to do with logistics is the moment when you look back and there is nothing there. When the door has closed, or the corridor has curved, or the last thin line of daylight has finally, quietly, given up. That was the moment Theseus faced inside the labyrinth. He entered, we must imagine, with a torch, because the labyrinth was below ground and without natural light, and the Greeks were not given to sending their heroes into total darkness without at least the dignity of a flame. He carried the sword he had retrieved from beneath that Trossenian stone, and he carried the thread, tied at the entrance, unwinding from its ball as he walked. That extraordinary piece of simplicity in the face of an architecture designed specifically to defeat simplicity. The thread is the part of this story that has never stopped meaning things. It has been read, across the centuries, as a symbol of memory, the thing that keeps us connected to where we began, even when the present moment is so disorienting that the past seems like something we invented. It has been read as a symbol of love. Ariadne's love made tangible, made navigable, made into something a man could hold in his hand in the dark. It has been read as reason itself, the rational thread of logic that a disciplined mind maintains even when everything around it is designed to produce confusion. And it has been read, perhaps most simply and most powerfully, as hope. Not the grand operatic hope of a person who believes with absolute certainty that things will be all right, but the small, practical, fiber-by-fiber hope of a person who simply refuses to let go of the line that connects them to the possibility of return. Theseus held the thread and walked. What the labyrinth would have been like from the inside. We have already touched on its design, its deliberate wrongness, its corridors that curved so gently over such long distances that the deviation from straight was imperceptible until it had carried you entirely around and deposited you, bewildered, back at a junction you had already passed. But there is another quality to consider, and it is a quality that no architectural description quite captures: the sound. A space like the labyrinth would have had an acoustic character unlike almost anything above ground. Stone corridors of varying widths and heights, twisting and intersecting and doubling back, would have created an environment in which sound behaved in deeply counterintuitive ways. A footstep might echo from a direction that held nothing. A voice, or something like a voice, might seem to come from directly ahead, when in fact its source was somewhere entirely different, separated by walls and turns and the labyrinth's own inscrutable geometry. For the Athenian tributes who had come before Theseus without a thread, without a sword, without any particular preparation for heroism, this acoustic disorientation would have been, in its way, as dangerous as any physical threat. In the dark, when you cannot trust your eyes, you rely on your ears. And, in the labyrinth, your ears lied to you. Theseus would have heard it before he found it. The ancient sources do not dwell extensively on the encounter itself. They tend toward a brisk efficiency at the moment of climactic violence that the modern reader, accustomed to lingering narrative, sometimes finds surprising. Theseus found the Minotaur. They fought. Theseus killed it. The thread brought him back. But let us slow that down. Let us sit for a moment in the space between the footsteps and the finding, and think about what that encounter must have held. The Minotaur, as we discussed in our previous segment, had lived its entire existence in the labyrinth, not as a temporary resident, not as a creature passing through on its way to somewhere else, but as the permanent occupant of a space that was, in its fundamental design, a prison. It had known nothing else, whatever cognition it possessed, and the myths are genuinely uncertain on this point, never quite deciding whether Asterion thought in the way a human thinks or felt in the way a human feels, had been formed entirely within those walls. Its understanding of space was the labyrinth. Its understanding of encounter was the periodic arrival of terrified young people who ran from it and eventually, in the dark, could run no further. Theseus did not run. This, more than anything else, may have been what the encounter's outcome turned upon. Every previous experience the Minotaur had of another being in its space had followed a predictable pattern. The smell of fear, the sound of flight, the chase through corridors it knew far better than any newcomer could, and then the end. Theseus broke that pattern from the first moment. He walked toward the sound. He held his torch steady. He kept the thread in his left hand and the sword in his right. And he moved, we must imagine, with the same quality of calm attentiveness that Ariadne had noticed when he stepped off the ship into the Cretan sun. The bearing of a person who has decided in advance that fear is information and not instruction. The fight, when it came, was desperate and physical and close, as fights in confined stone spaces must be. The Minotaur was enormous. The myths are consistent on this. It was not a creature you outmuscled easily or subdued with a single clean stroke. It was the product of divine intervention in the natural order, which is to say, it was not subject to the natural order's usual limitations. Theseus, who had already demonstrated on the road through the isthmus that his gift was not simply strength but adaptability. The ability to turn a situation's own logic against itself, found his way through it. Some versions say he used only his fists, having dropped or abandoned the sword, which lends the killing a raw and almost primal quality that feels appropriate to the space. Others preserve the sword as the instrument. What all versions agree on is the outcome. Asterion fell in the dark at the center of his own prison, and the labyrinth, which had been built to hold him, became instead his tomb. Then Theseus turned around, and this turning, this moment of reorientation in absolute darkness, in the center of a structure designed to prevent exactly this, is where the thread reveals its full meaning. He had dropped it as he walked, and now he gathered it, following it back through the corridors with the patient, deliberate attention of a man who knows that the hardest part is not always the thing you came to do. Sometimes the hardest part is the going home. He found the other tributes, those who had survived, not the Minotaur but the labyrinth itself, lost in its outer passages, alive but increasingly without hope. And he gathered them too, brought them with him along the thread, back toward the entrance, back toward the hairline crack of light that widened as they approached it, into the full and extraordinary fact of the open sky. Ariadne was waiting. There are images from ancient Greek pottery, recovered from sites across the Mediterranean world, that show this moment, the emergence from the labyrinth, the reunion at the entrance. They are not dramatic images in the way that the fight itself might have been dramatic. They tend toward the quiet, a figure emerging from a doorway, another figure reaching out a hand, between them, sometimes barely visible, the thread. The fleet sailed that same night. Minos, when he discovered what had happened, the Minotaur dead, the tributes gone, his daughter absent, and Daedalus almost certainly complicit, unleashed the fury of a king who has been made to look foolish, which is the most dangerous kind of fury there is. But the ships were already gone, moving through the Aegean dark toward the string of islands that lay between Crete and Athens. They stopped at Naxos. Why they stopped, and what happened there, is a story that has troubled readers and listeners for as long as the myth has been told. Ariadne was left on Naxos, whether sleeping and abandoned, or set ashore by agreement, or stranded by accident, or taken by the god Dionysus, who claimed her for his own. The versions diverge and have never been reconciled. What is consistent is that she did not return to Athens with the man she had saved. The thread had run out at the shoreline of her own future, and she was left with it in her hands. History, even mythological history, is not always fair to the people who hand over the thread. Theseus sailed on. Athens waited over the horizon, his father on the clifftop, watching the water, watching for the color of the sails against the morning sky. The sails were still black, not from cruelty, not from forgetfulness in the simple, easily explained sense, but from the weight of what had happened, from whatever interior space the labyrinth and the dark and the thing he had done in it had carved out in him during those hours underground. He had gone in one kind of person, moved through that experience, and emerged as something that had not yet fully settled into a new shape. The white sails were still in the hold. He did not remember them, or he remembered them, and could not, in that moment, quite reach across the distance between what he knew he should do and what he was capable of doing. Aegeus saw the black sails, and the rest of that story belongs to the next. Every story has an ending, but the endings of the oldest stories are rarely where we expect them to be. We expect them at the moment of triumph. At the threshold of the labyrinth, thread in hand, the creature behind us and the sky ahead. We expect them at the harbor, with the fleet returned and the city celebrating and the long, terrible arithmetic of the tribute finally, permanently, cancelled. We have been conditioned, by centuries of stories that close at the moment of victory, to believe that the resolution of the central problem is the end of the thing. But the Greeks knew better. The Greeks, who had thought harder, and more honestly about the shape of human experience than perhaps any civilization before or since, understood that the labyrinth does not end at its entrance, that the person who walks out of the dark is not the same person who walked in, and that what has been survived must still be lived with, which is, in its own way, a longer and more demanding journey than the one that went before. Aegeus died on the day his son came home. The old king had gone to the cliff, as he had gone every morning since the tribute ships departed, to watch the horizon, to wait for sails. And when the sails appeared, visible from a great distance, growing slowly from a speck to a certainty on the morning sea, they were black, as they had always been, as they had been on every previous tribute return, carrying grief instead of children. He did not wait for the ship to dock. He did not send a runner to confirm what he had seen. He had been waiting too long, and the black sails were too clear. And he was an old man who had sent his only son into a labyrinth to be eaten, and had known, in the part of himself that knew things without wanting to, that the world does not give back what it takes from you. Not really, not intact. He went into the sea from the cliff, and the sea that received him was named thereafter the Aegean, which is perhaps the most gentle of all the ways that Greek mythology has of marking the places where grief touched the world and left a permanent impression. Theseus stood in the harbor and watched the news come toward him across the dock, in the faces of the people who met the ship, in the quality of the silence where celebration should have been, and whatever he had carried out of the labyrinth, whatever hollowness the experience had opened in him, whatever had made the white sails impossible to remember in the hours of the crossing, now had the weight of his father's death added to it. He had killed the Minotaur. He had broken the tribute. He had saved the 14. He had done, by any external measure, everything that a hero was supposed to do. And in the same gesture, in the very act of sailing home, he had killed his father as surely as if he had pushed him from that cliff himself. The myth does not excuse him. It does not offer us a version in which the sails were changed, but the wind turned them dark again, or in which a messenger reached Aegeus before the sails were visible, or in which the old king simply waited one more hour before walking to the edge. The myth gives us what happened, without softening it, because the myth is not interested in making Theseus comfortable. It is interested in making him true. And the truth is that people who go into labyrinths and come back out again sometimes leave behind them, in the going and the coming, things they cannot afford to lose. The white sails were not forgotten because Theseus was careless. They were forgotten because the experience of the labyrinth had taken something from him, some ordinary, daily, forward-looking part of himself that remembers to change the sails, that keeps the thread between present action and future consequence from fraying, and had not given it back. This is what the labyrinth leaves behind. Not the absence of the monster, the absence of something in the person who survived it. Theseus became king of Athens, and by most mythological accounts he was a remarkable one. The king credited with the great act called synoikismos, the unification of the scattered villages of Attica into a single political entity centered on Athens. He was, in other words, the founder of Athens as a city rather than merely a place. He built institutions. He established laws. He created, from a collection of separate communities with their own loyalties and their own traditions, something that could reasonably be called a people. This is the work of a particular kind of genius, patient, diplomatic, structural, that sits in interesting tension with the image of the young man who walked through the isthmus killing bandits with their own methods. He grew into his kingship in the way that people who have been genuinely tested sometimes do, not by becoming softer, but by becoming larger. But the mythology of Theseus's later life is, by any honest accounting, a catalogue of losses. His wife Hippolyta, the Amazon queen, died. His friend Pirithous led him into an ill-fated descent into the underworld itself, from which he barely escaped. His son Hippolytus died through a chain of events so painful and so thoroughly rooted in misunderstanding and pride, and the catastrophic consequences of words spoken in anger, that the playwright Euripides made it the subject of one of the great tragedies of the ancient world. And in the end, Theseus died, not in battle, not heroically, but was thrown from a cliff on the island of Scyros by a king who feared him and wanted his land. He had entered a labyrinth once and come out. The world, it turns out, is full of labyrinths. The stone ones, at least, come with walls you can touch. Daedalus, whom we left in Sicily, building still, also carries his aftermath through the mythology with a weight that the stories never quite let him put down. Minos pursued him, as powerful men pursue the people who have embarrassed them, relentlessly and without proportion. He traveled from city to city, demanding that each ruler hand over the craftsman. His method of finding him was ingenious in the way that Minos was occasionally ingenious. He circulated a spiral shell and offered a great reward to anyone who could thread a string through it, knowing that the only person alive clever enough to solve the puzzle would be Daedalus. Sure enough, in Sicily, the puzzle was returned to him threaded. Daedalus had attached the string to an ant, made a small hole at the tip of the shell, baited it with honey, and let the ant walk the spiral from within. The king of Sicily, a man called Cocalus, had grown fond of Daedalus. He did not wish to give him up, and so, by some accounts, it was Cocalus's daughters who dealt with Minos, pouring boiling water or hot oil into the king's bath while he slept, and ending the pursuit in a manner that was efficient if not particularly dignified. Minos died in Sicily, far from Crete, in pursuit of a man he could not stop needing to punish. Daedalus outlived him. Daedalus, who had pushed a child from a cliff and built a prison for a creature that did not choose to exist, and given a king's daughter the means to undo everything he had been commissioned to protect. Daedalus outlived all of them and went on building. There is something in that which resists simple moral resolution. The myths do not punish Daedalus cleanly. They give him Icarus, yes, that devastating fall, that terrible echo of the crime in Athens. But then they let him continue. They let him remain, as though the story is acknowledging that genius is not a thing the world can afford to resolve neatly, that the people who build the labyrinths of history tend to outlast the people caught inside them, and that this is uncomfortable and true. Ariadne on Naxos was found by Dionysus, god of wine and transformation, and the ecstatic dissolution of boundaries, who took her as his wife and elevated her, in some traditions, to a form of divinity. Her crown became a constellation, set permanently in the sky. If this is compensation for what she lost, it is the kind of compensation that the myths specialize in, real and also completely beside the point. She saved Theseus. Theseus left her. The gods gave her stars, and somewhere in the waters between Naxos and Athens, the ball of thread floated on the surface of the Aegean, unwinding slowly in the current until there was nothing left of it at all. What endures then? What does the labyrinth leave us with, after the monster is dead and the architect is old and the hero has become a king, and the king has become a story, and the story has been told and retold across 3,000 years of human beings sitting together in the dark, passing it between them like something warm. It leaves us with the thread, not the physical thing. That is gone, long gone, dissolved into the salt water of a mythological sea. But the idea of it, the knowledge that in a space specifically designed to defeat understanding, to disorient and consume and reduce a person to pure lostness, the answer was connection, was the unbroken line between where you are and where you began, was the willingness of one person to press into another person's hand the simple means of not being lost forever. The labyrinth is very old, but the thing it teaches is older still. In every life without exception, there are passages that feel designed to confuse, corridors that seem to lead somewhere and then do not, junctions that offer choices without indicating consequences, rooms that close behind you. The walls are not always stone. Sometimes they are made of grief, or of time, or of the particular darkness that descends when something you were certain of turns out not to be true. Sometimes the monitor at the center is a fear you have been avoiding for so long that you have forgotten what it originally looked like, and what you find when you finally face it is smaller than the space you built around it. The Greeks knew this. They put it in a story, because stories are how human beings have always transmitted the knowledge that cannot be diagrammed or argued or proven, the knowledge that can only be felt and recognized and carried forward. Tie the thread at the entrance. Hold it as you walk, and when the darkness becomes total and the walls have taken your sense of direction and you can no longer remember which way is out, follow it back. It will hold. It has always held. The labyrinth ends here, and you are still holding the thread.